This is Rima Laibow MD. Welcome to the Dr. Rima Truth Reports, and you're listening to the drumbeat of freedom and the heartbeat of truth. With me, as always, my co-host and co-trustee of the Natural Solutions Foundation, Ralph Fusatola, JD. Hello, Ralph.
Welcome to the show.
You know, our usual procedure is to talk first about the health freedom news of the week here on the Dr. Rima Truth Reports, and then to bring in our guest. But tonight we're going to deviate from that because our guest is so special, and we don't want to lose him to fatigue. So we're going to start immediately with our guest, Dr. Peter Breggin. Dr. Breggin is one of my heroes. He was one of the first people to speak out, first professionals to speak out against psychiatric medication. He understands their dangers, he understands their impact, and he understands the fact that it is not only possible, it is preferable to practice psychiatry without psychiatric medication. Welcome, Dr. Breggin.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. I think we're going to give a lot of great information to your audience tonight.
I believe so. Dr. Breggin, would you tell us how you got to where you are now, what you're doing, and what convinced you that psychiatric medication was neither a panacea nor appropriate?
Well, it begins at age 18. I was a Harvard freshman, and a friend asked me to go out to the state mental hospital to volunteer. It was 1954, Dr. Rima, 1954. And that's how long I've been involved in this business of mental health. And when I got out to the hospital, it was the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. It was a state hospital. It was a snake pit. It was as bad as you can imagine. The mind-numbing drugs, the neuroleptics with Thorazine hadn't quite come in yet. They were doing lobotomies, electroshock, insulin coma. And two things immediately struck me because I had untrained eyes. I was just looking as a person at this. And one was that these people who were being treated so badly, like dirt by the staff, or worse than dirt by the staff, seemed to me to be human beings. And they didn't seem so different from me. They just seemed like they maybe had a rougher time than me. And I had this huge sense that anybody could lose it like this, and anybody could end up in a place like this, and that this place was going to make people worse. And it struck me that the treatments were making people worse. And I remember talking to one of the psychiatrists at the time. I eventually became the leader of the program. So we stole keys to the hospital. I got used to us having keys. And I had free run of the place. We had a group of a couple of hundred Harvard and Radcliffe students coming in. And I remember asking one of the psychiatrists, well, how do you think this insulin coma works? And he said, oh, it kills bad brain cells. And that just struck me as absolutely ridiculous. I could see what was happening to the patients. First of all, I mean, I knew without any training that you weren't going to find the bad brain cells when you put somebody in a coma, if there were such a thing. And I could see that basically this treatment was making people docile. That shock treatment, insulin coma, patients would come in like upset human beings. They'd go through these procedures and they'd come out completely docile, manageable, dependent, and just terribly injured by the treatment. And in the process, I started to work with individual patients. We all began, leaders, we began to see people on a regular basis. And it became clear they were hungry for companionship. They were lonely. They were humiliated. So I proposed to the superintendent that we each get our own patient of the leaders, not the 200 coming and going, but the 12 or 15 of us who were leaders in the program, that we all get our own patient assigned to us for the year, and we would be supervised by this really nice social worker who was there. And he hemmed and he hawed. The psychoanalytic president guidance of the social worker, we got just about every one of these lost souls off the back wards and out of the hospital. And so it became clear to me, Dr. Lee, before I even got started as a professional, that people needed affection, support, encouragement, relationship, and I even called it love in some of the things I began writing at that young age. And that's basically how I ended up going into psychiatry. Before I got started.
Richard, I need to talk to our producer here. Richard, we're not taking a call yet. For some reason, a call just came on. Caller, I would like it if you would wait, please, until we've had a chance to talk with Dr. Breggin and see if we have time to take calls. Okay? Go ahead, Dr. Breggin.
But basically, we got just almost all the patients out of the hospital, and they stayed out for a couple of year follow-up, most of them. Well, this was a big deal. We got written up in the President's Commission on Mental Health, 1962, as one of the resources that could change psychiatry and so on. But what happened, of course, was that in came Thorazine. And Thorazine was a chemically lobotomizing agent. And now you didn't have to talk to the patient. You didn't have to deal with the patient. You could turn any patient into a robotic, docile, manageable, crushed person with these drugs. That's just what they were doing on the wards. It was so much easier than shock and lobotomy and insulin coma. And by the time I got out of medical school and started looking for residencies back in 62, things had begun to change. And psychiatry no longer even was going to allow a psychological or social wing. Psychiatry was moving toward complete collaboration with the drug companies. Then in the early 70s, and I traced this in, I've written more than 20 books and dozens of scientific articles. In one of my books that has probably influenced as many people as any, Toxic Psychiatry, I traced the board meetings of the Psychiatric Association and how they decided that since they were failing, since the psychosocial therapies were taking all the patients away, how all the women patients in California were now going to women social workers and women family therapists, and doctors were losing money and the association was losing money, that they would have to re-medicalize by going into collaboration with the drug companies. And as I came out into my residency, my first year at Harvard was the leading school in the country, so it was the leading worst school in the country. Harvard was already in bed with the drug companies, still is today. We could talk about those scandals. And I ended up deciding that I would go into private practice. I thought I was going to be some young professor somewhere, but I went into private practice. And I was in private practice without meds. I decided that I could treat people without meds. People need a relationship. The more psychotic and disturbed the person was, the more they needed a relationship, not less. I went into practice, and in 72, and I can end in about here because this is the beginning of my reform work, really. In 72, I found out lobotomy was coming back, Dr. Rima. And I really went broke for about 3 or 4 years. I devoted everything I had to stopping an international resurgence of lobotomy. I worked with Congress. I got legislation passed to do a psychosurgery commission and basically stop the return of it internationally, really, of lobotomy and psychosurgery. And there I was, a full-time volunteer reformer, which I've been in addition to my other work now, going back, 50 years to when I was a college student. That's it in a nutshell.
Very interesting.
Then you went into the private practice of psychiatry?
Yeah, I've been in private practice ever since. I don't start people on meds. Once in a while, if somebody is just horribly overwrought, I'll give them 2 days of a sleeping med to help them break the cycle. I mean, that's literally it. And I knock on wood, it's a blessing and it's good fortune. I've never had a suicide in my practice. I've only, in a full practice for most of the time, I've only had 3 suicide attempts since 1968. And I think the reason the practice works well, in addition to being blessed, is and being maybe watched over because of the other things I do. It's I don't drug people. I work hard to connect to people, to relate to them. What I eventually realized was the most important thing you can do to really save a soul is to involve their family, to get everybody around them who cares, to change their attitudes and work and do family work. And I started doing that very early, before there was hardly anything written about it. And then there have been a number of huge, along the way, huge confrontations with the establishment. I don't know how much to tell you about that.
Oh, please tell us about that.
Okay. Well, after one of the really big ones was after Ginger joined my life 30 years ago. We found out that the federal government was planning a multi-agency youth violence prevention initiative that was going to go into the inner cities of America and find genetic and biological reasons why people of color were growing up violent. This is like the eugenics from Germany, only instead of being directed at the Jews, it's being directed at young black children. They were going to study, collect data in pregnant women, follow these children. And when we started doing freedom of information, I think some of the people inside the government really cared about what we were doing. And I got handwritten notes, probably by Fred Goodwin, who was at the time the leader of the whole psychiatric portion of the federal government, drawing little circles about what they were doing and with arrows pointing toward Prozac, which was the big money maker, as what they would start giving to the children for violence, when it causes violence, of course. And Ginger and I, we eventually defeated a big conference they were going to hold. We cut off all their funding. We got the Black Caucus on our side. We got conservative Republicans on our side who thought it was immoral. And that was a major victory. We wrote about that in the War Against Children of Color. A couple of the other things. I was the first person to write extensively about violence and suicide from the antidepressants. I first mentioned it in 1991 in Toxic, and then I became the expert. You would have no way of knowing this probably. I became the expert appointed by the courts and by a consortium of attorneys for all the Prozac suits against Eli Lilly. There were like 150 or more of them at the time. So that immersed me as the scientist for all the different lawyers.
I did know that you were deeply involved in the legal actions against Prozac, and I did know that you had been an early pioneer in documenting the disastrous impact of antipsychotics on the brain and on behavior. So yes, I did antipsychotics and antidepressants, and that's one of the reasons that I said that you're among my heroes.
Well, thank you. And the antipsychotics were another area I went after, because I realized after I did when I did the anti-lobotomy campaign, Dr. Rima, when I did that, I kept asking myself, why am I being attacked by every single major medical psychiatric establishment for going after lobotomy? I didn't expect that. And then it began to dawn on me that to some extent, every psychiatric treatment has a lobotomy aspect to it. The antipsychotic drugs, now we're talking about Risperdal, Zyprexa, Geodol, Vega, and so on, they all produce a chemical lobotomy.
Yes.
And then I started looking at the other drugs, and I realized that they all are causing frontal lobe dysfunction, not as complete as the antipsychotics, but they're all disabling the brain. And it all the treatments are disabling the brain, and none of them are helping the brain. And of course, we could talk for 2 days about the data and the science behind that, and you can find it in my books. But it became clear to me that the whole idea of a psychoactive substance improving somebody's mental well-being was fraudulent. It was always harming the brain. And if the person got a little euphoric, they might feel better for a week or two and then go searching for more and more of it over the years. But more often, people got apathetic, didn't realize how apathetic they were. They'd say they felt better. They'd come up to me and say, "You're wrong, Dr. Breggin. I'm so much better on my drugs." And they'd be flat, lifeless, and didn't know it.
Yes, yes. We had a parallel history in a way. You started out directly in the psychiatric reality. I was an English major. People have heard me perhaps tell this story before. I was an English major. So I had a completely blank slate when it came to the sciences of medicine. And in my first pharmacology class, my professor of pharmacology, who was very famous, one of the authors of the standard Goodman and Gilman text, said that all drugs, not just psychiatric drugs, but all drugs, work the same way. That is, they poison enzyme systems. If you like the results, you call it a therapeutic benefit. If you don't, you call it a side effect. But in fact, there's nothing but a side effect when you give a drug, or side effects when you give a drug, and that is due to the poisoning of enzyme systems. And I said, wait a minute. Enzymes are the very stuff of life. If you poison enzyme systems, how are you helping anybody? You might suppress some symptoms, but in the end, you're making things much, much worse overall. And the answer was essentially shut up, sit down, and learn the answers to the questions if you want to be a doctor. And that stuck with me so profoundly that I could not figure out why anybody would use drugs except in an emergency room or a surgery suite. Then, when I entered my psychiatric residency, because I went to medical school in order to become a psychiatrist. When I
did that. That's interesting.
Yep. Yes. When I entered my psychiatric residency in 1970, the antidepressants, Nathan Klein's antidepressants, were just coming online in a big way. There had been early antipsychotics, but the antidepressants were making inroads. And what I saw was that the profession of psychiatry decided that now they could be considered real doctors because they had something to write a prescription for. And they embraced these terrible, terrible and badly tested, untested, toxic substances which lobotomized people, exactly as you say, because it made them real doctors. It also made them real money. That's how I saw it. And like you, I determined that I wasn't going to do this to people. Let's talk about violence and psychiatric drugs, and let's talk about the numbers of people on psychiatric drugs in the United States, including the numbers of children.
And of course, including...
Maybe we should focus on the latest event of violent behavior related to drugs.
Let's talk about soldiers on psychiatric drugs.
The numbers of people on psychiatric drugs are not too available in the U.S. Some of the figures that we have are that, for example, 20% of women are on antidepressants alone. And that doesn't include the women who've gotten off them and will get on them. At any moment, you have 20%. That means that maybe a third or more of women are going to be on these drugs, maybe more at one time or another. The numbers are astronomical. I would say that I think we've reached the point where 50% of Americans at some point or another are going to be on a psychiatric drug at some time or another. And some data we have for children is just looking at stimulants. If you look at boys disaster. It's a giant social experiment of poisoning brains. And and the results are terrible. We're seeing more and more long-term that it's building up chronicity. It's building up the roles of the disabled. Used to be hardly any children who were on psychiatric disability. Now we've got hundreds of thousands. So it's a catastrophe of a size that hasn't been measured and but it's really quite large. The issue of violence, it was very clear to me within 3 years after Prozac coming out that the newspapers were filled with stories of violence on the drug. Nowadays, the newspapers won't say that a traffic accident, the person was on Prozac. They won't say it anymore. But then the drug companies hadn't taken over yet, the media as much as they are now. And I was able by 1994, in talking back to Prozac, to put in innumerable newspaper stories. Doctors were telling me that their patients were getting irritable and anxious and touchy and angry on this drug. It was in the air to a great extent at that point in time. In fact, my book in 1994, Talking Back to Prozac, was a bestseller. And after that came pharmaceutical industry realized they couldn't allow that. They couldn't allow critics to be heard. They started spending, a fortune on lobbying the Congress and the press and going to coroner's offices and helping DAs in criminal cases where somebody committed a crime on psych drugs. Just shut down this whole process. So if we were talking in 1994, there would be more, in some ways, public awareness even than now. But these shootings are bringing back the public awareness. But it was apparent to me from the beginning. And then, as I said, I had so many cases coming across my desk over the years. One of them that is the best known is Eric Harris at Columbine. And only a couple of years ago, USA Today said that we now knew that Eric Harris wasn't taking any antidepressants at the time he committed the massacres at Columbine along with Dylan Klebold. And I wrote to respond to this very, very important certainty that they had declared. I sent him a letter, and I said, listen, here's the numbers. I have the FDA report on Eric Harris's blood level of Luvox, which ironically says that at the time of his death he had a therapeutic level of Luvox, which is fluvoxamine, which is an SSRI, very similar to the others. Mm-hmm. I said that the coroner has confirmed this. Here's a coroner's report. And they didn't even answer my letter. So that just stood there in USA forever that he wasn't on it. I got to look at his records because I was involved in some of the legal cases surrounding that. Nothing that went to court, to trial. And it was so clear that he was a year earlier put briefly on Zoloft, didn't react well to it. That tells you something. Put on Luvox, and what was he put on? He was put on them for obsessiveness. Not craziness, not severe depression. And he stays on the Luvox. He gets a big increase in his dose a couple of months before the shootings. And over that year, you can trace him developing into a manic, paranoid psychosis. He's grandiose. He's out of control with his violence. He's blaming the world. He's going to get even. He's totally whacked out. And he's taking his drug all along, as best we can tell. And as I said, we know he had the quote therapeutic level in his bloodstream at the time of his death. And I've been involved in a number of cases where we could draw very clearly that parallel. But in no case is it much more clear than what we have with Aaron Alexis, the 34-year-old man at the Navy Yard who went on this wild rampage. Alexis had violent tendencies. We know that. Well, that just means that it's worse for him to get a drug that can make him violent. And on August talk to him through the wall. It was giving him vibrations in his body. They were persecuting him and following him from hotel to hotel. And he was having trouble sleeping. And on August 23rd, he went to, it's August 23rd, I remember the massacre is September 16th. August 23rd, he goes to the Providence VA and they give him trazodone. They give him a short supply for sleep. August 28th, he's in D.C., goes to the VA and he gets his trazodone refilled. And so we go from the 23rd of August to the 16th of September. It's about 24 days or so. And in that time, he goes ahead and buys the shotgun on April 14th. April 14th. And remember, he started on the 23rd of August. This is a very short period of time, and it's the time period that we usually see the violence break out in. In Eric Harris's case, he had an increase in his dose in that kind of a time period before the violence. So you see an increase in dose. Sometimes a decrease will do it, but it's usually an increase in dose, or in this case, starting it. And I think that it gives us a really clear picture of a man who had gun violations, a man who fired his gun, who obviously should have had much greater repercussions than he got, but who managed to at least keep the violence from killing anybody until he's exposed to his first psychiatric drug. Now, talking heads are going on the air, and they're saying that trazodone is a harmless antidepressant. It's used as a sleeping pill, which is true, and that it's relatively harmless. Well, I think one reason why it seems more harmless is because people have been using it in small doses to sleep. But that doesn't mean that some people aren't going to react to it like it's a little bigger dose. And the FDA label, and this is breathtaking, the FDA label, the way a label is made, a drug company develops a drug, and then they send all their data in to the FDA, and the FDA negotiates with them about what a label will look like. Well, trazodone has a lot of what's called a class label for antidepressants in it. And that one, I read you a little section of that label, which is almost verbatim from an article that I wrote the year before the label was created, and which the FDA gave to every single member of the psychopharmaceutical committee that recommended the label. So they went out of their way. I was really surprised and pleased by this. The person managing the FDA hearings, in the small packets these people get, in there's this huge review article by me, and this sentence reads like it's out of my articles, out of my books. It says that the drug is associated with the following, quote, anxiety, agitation, panic attacks, insomnia, and now it gets even, all those things can lead to violence. Now it really gets scary. Irritability, hostility, aggressiveness, impulsivity, akathisia, which is a terrible inner torment that can lead to violence, hypomania, and mania. Mania is a severe disorder that's often psychotic and very violent. So there's a list in the label that these talking heads are going to have to ignore, which actually included irritability, which means in psychiatry the tendency to overreact aggressively, hostility, which means hostility, aggressivity, which means aggressivity, impulsivity, mania, and so on. Then there's a medication guide, which patients are supposed to be given by their doctor or the pharmacy. Doctors are encouraged by the FDA specifically to give the label and to give the medication guide. And the medication guide has a list of things that you better look out for and report to your doctor. And one of them has the word violent in it. It says if the patient, if you're the patient, if you're acting aggressive, being angry, or violent. The medication guide, which is a family is also supposed to get, also warns about, quote, acting on dangerous impulses. This is the trazodone official FDA medication guide. Well, you'd say, well, that's really about the other antidepressants because trazodone is sedating. That's what your psychiatrist, if they know anything, they may not even know enough to say that. They'll say that. Well, it so happens that trazodone is an inhibitor of the reuptake of serotonin. Does that sound familiar? It's the serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Just like the ones that are called SSRIs. Now, the S in SSRI means selective. Well, trazodone doesn't only inhibit the reuptake of serotonin, it does some other things. So it's a non-selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. That makes no difference to the extent that the serotonin reuptake inhibition is responsible for these horrendous adverse effects, as it probably is. Then trazodone has the same effects. And then you go ahead and say, well, that might just make people sleepy. But if you start going into the literature, you find out that this sleepy-making drug has a greater tendency, literally, than Paxil and Prozac to be a cause of anxiety and stimulation. So this is a dangerous drug. It hasn't come up as often as other drugs because it's given usually in that one nighttime dose. But you give it then to a man who's got a history of violence, who's been psychotic, probably is psychotic at the time he gets the drug, and you are pouring huge fuel on the fire. So in this case, we have a real one-to-one correlation between the abrupt, severe worsening of his condition without any known environmental catastrophe in his life. No known environmental catastrophe in his life. We have this huge event happen. So this is a classic that shouldn't be ignored. One other thought. I'm talking a lot. Let me fill it out with one other thought. When the shootings occurred, the horrendous shootings in Newtown with Adam Lanza, excuse me, I watched a lot of TV at that time, and I and my wife, and we got film of Tom Ridge on Fox News. Tom Ridge was at that point, the past head of Homeland Security, and Tom Ridge had been on the Virginia Tech commission looking into the shootings at Virginia Tech. Tom Ridge came out and said, once only, that we had to look at psychiatric drugs as a possible cause here. That's on Fox. And then on the CNN, the liberal partner in being the leader with Fox, Sanjay Gupta, America's doctor, Sanjay gives a 5 or 6 minute rap. Oh, we got to look into the risk of psychiatric drugs in Connecticut. And I captured that. I got my assistant to capture it, and you can find it on YouTube in my YouTube section, or just go to YouTube and put in Tom Ridge, drugs and violence, Sanjay Gupta, or go to my Breggin YouTube and you can find it. And they never said another word. They never said another word.
Of course they didn't. Of course they didn't. Where does the sponsorship come from? Where does the interlocking directorate sit? Of course they didn't. The amazing thing is that these brief moments of common sense and reality were actually broadcast.
Yes, that was a shock to me. I was really surprised. And again, just go on and go to Breggin on YouTube and find your way through, or do a search for this, and I've got it up there. You'll find Tom Ridge and Sanjay Gupta talking about this stuff. It's real, but the power is incredible. A friend of mine, a co-worker in the reform work, I haven't gotten to talk to her yet about this, but she has reported that in Connecticut, arguments the Attorney General has made is that if they released his records, everyone would stop taking their psychiatric drugs. So,
well, yes, as a matter of fact, that's a very good point. When people come to you who are suffering, and there's no doubt that psychiatric conditions are very, very painful. They're emotionally painful. They can be painful to the people around the sufferer. They can be painful to the sufferer, him or herself. When people come to you and they're suffering, and other psychiatrists would, or other non-psychiatrists would instantly whip out the prescription pad, what do?
well, first,
How do you work with people?
First, I have some beautiful short videos on this that you can get on YouTube on my website called Simple Truths About Psychiatry. I've had 40,000 people so far, over 40,000 watched these first 4 of them. And I just put a 5th up. And I give 2 examples. You know, the 2 toughest examples we deal with are suicidal patients and psychotic patients. And when someone comes to me and they want to end their lives, I don't say to them, oh my God, we got to stop these emotions. I've heard enough. Basically, what you have psychiatrist is, I've heard enough. Here's some drugs. And make a promise you won't hurt yourself. Maybe he'll say that, and maybe he'll consider putting the person in a mental hospital. What I say is, you know, thank God you're having feelings. People who scare me are the people who come in without feelings. You're full of feelings, and the feeling is you want to die. And we talk about that. I say, well, talk to me about that feeling. You're safe here. I tell them that. You're safe. I've never locked up anybody against their will. I've never locked up anybody my entire career except in my training. Never locked anybody up, and I've never given anybody a drug to suppress their feelings. So you're safe with me. I'm going to actually talk with you. We're safe. That makes a big change right away because they're terrified of what's going to happen to them. They want help, but they're terrified of all these consequences. So then we talk, and I say, well, the good news is that anybody who hates himself or herself the way you do, the way you want to die, the way life is hopeless for you, that means you must be so hugely disappointed. You must have a vision. You must be reacting to what you don't have, to what you want, to what you didn't get, to what you lost. Let's talk about your vision of a good life. Because this energy you have, the degree you want to hurt yourself, that's the degree you want to live that you've given up. And so I enter a discussion with them on the basis that we want to hear about all the painful feelings, and we want to hear about all the hopes and the desires and the wishes. And I reassure people that usually feeling this way is short-lived. If you just work on it, talk about it, and in months from now you'll feel better than you did before, ever before, because you'll face this crisis. You'll have faced it and learned about yourself, and you've done life. So that's how I approach it. And in my heart, I know that with all the talk, what's really going to matter is, does that person think I care so much about them that they're not going to go off and kill themselves? Mm-hmm. That's like the fundamental.
Essentially, you're offering a relationship within appropriate boundaries around which someone can regain, or through which someone can regain their equilibrium and internal capacity for self-regulation.
Yes, that is certainly in other language that it can be put in, absolutely. Now, it's a little different if someone's psychotic, because if they're psychotic, their issue isn't that they've lost hope. It's not just that. It's they've lost connectivity. Their social fabric is shattered. I like to remind people that we're really made of each other, you know. In the days when we were nurse, we're made of mother's milk. We're made of the genetics of the father and mother, the flesh of the mother. Then we're made of the nurturing of the people around us. We start out with very little going to speak, how we're going to feel about ourselves in life, and we become this human being through the nurture. So we're made of what other people have done in their relationships with us, as well as made of other people's bodies. Well, when somebody at age of 15 comes apart at the seams, withdraws into her room, and is hallucinating and deluded, that person, for whatever reason, has completely had her fabric torn apart, her social fabric, and she no longer trusts anybody. She's usually in a state of shame. People don't realize that, but if you could pinpoint one thing about people who get called schizophrenic, in addition to the social fabric tearing up, they're feeling horribly humiliated, worthless, and ashamed. Not guilty, ashamed, like they're nothing. And so when that person's brought in, usually by somebody else, I ask if they'd like to talk to me alone or with their family, if they, whichever way is fine. And my job is to create an environment where they can get a glimmer of safety with another human being. Safety, security, trust. I again start out and say, hey, you're safe. I know the other doctor talked about sending you to a hospital. I don't do that. You can go to a hospital if you want. Parents could take you, but I don't force people to hospitals. And I'm not going to give you that numbing drug that you refuse to take after a week.
Limit yourself. Let me guess that you do not limit yourself to a 45-minute hour or a 50-minute hour, and that this kind of psychiatry takes time, that it takes compassion, it takes connection, but it also takes fluid and flexible time commitments, which of course would not work terribly well in a routinized, scheduled setting where what's important is the productivity of the minute, not the protection of the patient. Am I correct?
Well, you basically are very, very correct. In fact, when I was young, I would only see one patient, try to space them 2 hours apart in case they wanted an extra hour. But now I don't have to do that. My practice is, I keep it fairly small. And I may have 2 or 3 patients in a row, not usually more than that. But I will be there if they need to come back in the evening. I will be there in the morning. I will be there on the phone. So availability is very important. All my patients get my office number, my home number, and my cell phone. So availability is incredibly important. And the interesting thing is, I've had people visit me who are engineers and various kinds of business, and I tell them that all my patients have my cell phone number, and they might get 3 calls in the weekend, from one or another distressed business person, and I don't get any. Because by and large, people love that security that they can get in touch with me. But during drug withdrawal, people often, that's when people do have to call, and they do, because drug withdrawal is so hazardous.
All right.
Oh,
Indeed.
Doctor, we are just losing Dr. Rima's connection.
We are. Well, then let me step in. Dr. Ralph Fusatola here, listening to this very interesting discussion. Dr. Rima is actually in Argentina this week. Dr. Rima and the president of our foundation, General Burt, are living in Santiago de Chile. But because Chile closes down during this entire week for National Week, Rima and Bert decided to explore the neighboring country of Argentina. So she is possibly difficult to reach. Nonetheless, our discussion should certainly continue.
She's not in the U.S. right now?
No, she's not. No, she practiced.
What do you know? She
practiced medicine for almost 40 years in the U.S., in New York State, finally in Croton-on-Hudson, where she and General Burt have had a beautiful home. But they decided to leave the United States at a certain point. Burt is the highest ranking former military officer to be an oath keeper. And a number of years ago, he made some statements that contradicted the official government position on what happened on 9/11/2001. And as a result of that, they decided to explore living abroad for a while. They've lived in Thailand and Panama and are currently in Santiago, where Dr. Rima is working on creating the Dr. Rima Institute. There we go. Dr. Rima, we're doing good. And by the way, we're about 45 minutes into, I guess, a psychiatrist's hour into Dr. Rima Reports on Revolution Radio. Dr. Rima's guest is Dr. Peter Breggin, psychiatrist. The two psychiatrists have been comparing notes, and they both began to practice around the same time, and both have done the same thing. That is, refused to go along with the mainstream. Dr. Rima, back to you.
Hello again.
Hello again. Right now I'm in Argentina, so I consider us very lucky to be connected at all. Dr. Breggin, have you had the psychiatric profession come down on you? I know that this is a difficult path that doctors like you and I have chosen to tread. What has the psychiatric profession had to say about your not following the standard of care, which is to drug people senseless?
Well, imagine your worst whistleblower movie. We've had everything. We've had, I don't like to go into details, but we have pretty much had to contend over the years with everything. So you imagine it, and it probably happened. So, you know, some of the companies that I go up against are literally the largest in the world.
Yes.
The psychiatric profession is huge, and often they will, especially in the early years, they would actually try to rev up their patients to harm me in some way or attack me in some way. Anything you can imagine pretty much has come my way. The biggest turning point was when they went after my medical license.
I'm going to ask you about that.
Yeah, they went after my medical license, but they chose the wrong ground. See, they couldn't find any of my patients who were mad at me. So they went after me for remarks I made on Oprah Winfrey, critical of psychiatric drugs. They tried to make that an attack on my license, but it was freedom of speech. So after a few very, very scary months,
I'll bet.
we had a complete victory, and the state of Maryland ended up apologizing to me because I think they were afraid I was going to sue them for attacking my freedom of speech. And then a miracle happened. A miracle happened. I was broke. I was absolutely broke from the reform work, and then from this in the mid '80s, and then from this license attack and having lawyers, and I get this phone call from somebody who says that he was out of the country and he just got back, and I was his hero, and he wanted to know what he could do for me, and I told him, that I didn't want to sue other people. I wanted to do my reform work, and I said, but I'm broke, and he said, well, what did it cost you? And I said, it cost me $30,000. That was back in '85. That's a lot of money. It's probably like $100 now. I said, it cost me $35,000, whatever it was. And he said, well, hang on. He said, he yells to his wife, hey, would you write a check for the doc? And I thought, this is a hoax. And 3 days later, the check arrived. And that victory was when my wife, who's only been with me for about 4 or 5 years, 30 years together now, Ginger, that's when she decided to give up all the interesting things she was doing and to just partner with me in the reform work. And she got the press on our side. She got coverage of the license attack 3 times in the New York Times. Dan Goldman wrote an article about it with a picture of me. She got it in the Associated Press. She got it all over the place. And I think that really intimidated them. And I went from being just some guy who was, nobody knew, to being then a politically recognizable person. And I got my first big book published, Toxic Psychiatry. So that big attack completely backfired on them. And there haven't been those kinds of attacks since then. There haven't been legal attacks since then.
Ralph, I wonder if you would mute your mic until you're ready to speak. We're getting a lot of sounds from your
My
part
end, of course.
Okay, thank you. And that's not to disinvite you to speak, of course. So Ralph, who is an attorney, has been guiding and defending and supporting people like you who have been under this kind of attack, and people like me who have been threatened with attack, but the attacks have always collapsed like an ill-timed souffle, a toxic souffle, before they actually gathered enough steam to go anywhere.
I think we've lost Dr. Rima.
I think we have.
Let me take a moment and just say that to the audience, that when you hear what Dr. Rima and I are saying, don't just stop your psychiatric drugs, because stopping a psychoactive substance and all psychiatric drugs abruptly is dangerous. And I've written a book about it called Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal. And the first half of the book tells you all the reasons to stop taking the drugs, all the damage. The second half shows you how to work and hopefully create a team around you to gradually and safely come off the psychiatric drugs.
Dr. Breggin, do you have a website? Do you have a website that we can cite for the folks who are listening?
Yeah. And in fact, we're actually selling psychiatric drug withdrawal at more of a discount than Amazon is.
Excellent.
It's Breggin.com, BREGGIN.com.
Got it on the screen too. Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, we will be coming up to a break in the program in a little while. I'm sure Dr. Rima will be back on before that happens or thereabouts. But before the show, you were discussing with Dr. Rima that you said there was a statement that you wanted to read that you thought might be useful for us to consider. And I'm wondering.
No, that was I've done that already. That was just some of the sections from my statement, which I've issued to the world and to the press, which details this material about the antidepressant and the deceased murderer.
Oh, I understand. Yes, very, very interesting. One of the issues that I had wanted to raise, and I thought you might want to address earlier, was the relationship between the psychiatric drugs and what's happening to the American military. I understand from General Burt, the president of our foundation, that up until 1991, it was against American military policy to allow any soldier who was on psychiatric meds to be in combat. And that was changed in 91, and that today, at least 20% of the combat soldiers are on the very same psychiatric medications that you and Dr. Rima were discussing, the very same psychiatric medications that seem to have those effects. Could you address that and whether it also relates to the fact that more American soldiers are dying from suicide than from combat injuries?
Yes. And in fact, if you go to Breggin.com, you can see my half-hour testimony before the U.S. Congress Veterans Affairs Committee in 2010. They created a hearing largely based on my book, Medication Madness. It's called Medication Madness, the Role of Psychiatric Drugs in Violence, Crime, and Suicide. Those are probably the two books that would cover things for you, Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal and Medication Madness.
Okay, let me get that down here for people. Thank you.
The hearings, I present the whole scientific basis for this issue. That's right. Before the Iraq War, soldiers couldn't go into combat on psychiatric drugs. And now, I've heard figures as high as 30% and more.
And rising.
It's high, Dr. When you're back. Yes.
I'm back.
Yes. In combat. Now, imagine this. You're 19 years old. You're going into combat. You're given antidepressants. You could even be given an antipsychotic for sleep. They've been doing that. You may be given a stimulant. You're given a benzo, an addictive benzo.
And we are coming up to the break right this very minute. And Dr. Breggin, please stay with us. This is the most important part of the discussion right now.
Revolution Radio. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
This is Dr. Rima, and you are coming in on the second hour of the Dr. Rima Truth Reports. Thank you so much for joining us. Our co-host, Ralph Fusatola, JD, is with me, as is Dr. Peter Breggin, a brave and truth-telling psychiatrist who, like me, has decided that drugs are very bad and not necessary for health, for recovery, for vitality, for the enjoyment and pursuit of life and humanness. Dr. Breggin, thank you for coming back for the second hour. I know you'll only be with us for part of this hour. Before we begin our conversation again, I would like to remind people that there are a great many absolutely extraordinary shows on Revolution Radio here at freedomslips.com, and you should listen to them. You should also consider very seriously the coffee that you drink. Now, why did I say that? Well, because the Natural Solutions Foundation, which brings you this show, has an eco-demonstration project in which we are teaching people how to grow food without the use of chemicals, because lots and lots of farmers around the world have quite literally forgotten, and they don't know how to deal with the plagues that the overuse of chemicals and synthetic fertilizers and other unwholesome practices have allowed to grow. And so they're trapped in this cycle of death-dealing chemicals. So we have a coffee farm in Panama where we have a certified organic production, and it's there in order to bring us coffee and in order to teach farmers how to do this kind of farming when they don't know how. That farm is in Panama, and we produce what is arguably the best coffee in the world, according to a number of experts who have all come to the same conclusion. Quote, "This is the best coffee I've ever tasted." Now, you can have that coffee and support health freedom at the same time. Go to valleyofthemooncoffee.com or .org and make your donation, and we'll send you the absolutely most spectacular coffee you've ever had. Valley of the Moon Coffee has what nature intends coffee to have, and coffee turns out to be a health drink. Even Dr. Joe Mercola, who was a coffee opponent for a really long time, has decided now that coffee, healthful coffee, is a health drink, and he's right. So it's delicious, it supports health freedom, it helps to bring you the Dr. Rima Truth Reports, and it's actually got all kinds of health benefits. Go to www.valleyofthemooncoffee.org and get what we say is a little bit of heaven in a cup. You'll be helping yourself, and you'll be helping health freedom. So back to our guest. We're talking with Dr. Peter Breggin. You probably know his name already. Dr. Breggin has been writing books like Listening to Prozac, Toxic Psychiatry. He's been a court expert. Talking My apologies.
That's
Um,
fine. I
thank
interrupted you.
for
I
correcting me.
apologize for interrupting. Go ahead.
No, 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 no. It's a necessary correction. Um, and he's been telling the truth about toxic psychiatry for a very long time, and he's paid a heavy price for it. Dr. Breggin, do you feel comfortable taking some caller questions at this point? People rarely have the opportunity to speak with you in this way, I think.
Yeah, sure. And I'm just looking at my energy at this hour here. It's 11 where I'm. So let's say, another maybe 15 or 20 minutes, okay? And I'm
Perfect.
happy to come back
Okay.
again sometime after I've rested up.
Oh,
In the future.
I'd love to have you do that. Maybe we'll pre-record it. Because this is a late hour, perhaps where you are. You're in Maryland on the East Coast, yes?
No, I'm in. That was in the last 10 years. I've been in Ithaca, New York, upstate New York.
Ah,
I moved up here to live on. I live on Cayuga Lake, which is this gorgeous.
Oh, how
lake.
lovely! Yes, of course. That's a very beautiful part of the world. So, Richard, our producer will put people through on the switchboard. I'd like you to ask your question in a focused way that applies to as many people as possible, so that Dr. Breggin can share his information in a way that helps lots of people understand things better. People come to me frequently and they say, if I didn't take the medication that I'm on, then I couldn't manage. I am afraid to get off the medication. I'm sure they say that to you. What do you say to them at that point?
Well, first of all, that's the best possible question that you could have asked. You really framed the whole problem, Rima. Well, first of all, there's a lot of different aspects to this issue. The first one that often comes up is that the person believes that they need the drug because when they miss some doses or when they try to come off, they feel terrible. But when you feel terrible during a drug dose or in the first few weeks of stopping a drug, and you just feel like things are just going down the tubes for you, that's almost always drug withdrawal. So the problem isn't that you need the drug, it's that you need to find a way to more comfortably and safely come off the drug. My colleagues in psychiatry, excluding Dr. Rima and a few others, commonly tell patients, see, you need the drug, how good you feel, it's a week later, you got to get back on. Well, you could say the same thing to somebody who was on alcohol, because if they try to come off alcohol, they're going to go through a very distressing period and even through the DTs. And in fact, something identical to that, or nearly identical, will happen if you try to come off the benzos if you've been on them a long time. Drugs like Xanax and Klonopin and Ativan. So the person who feels that they've been on the drug and they really need the drug, the first thing for you to look at is, am I confusing withdrawal? And is my doctor, my prescriber, ignorant or hiding the information about withdrawal and telling me I need the drug, when what it really proves is that the drug has changed my brain, and my brain needs time to recover. So that's one of the issues that occurs. Another issue that occurs that is very insidious is what I call medication spellbinding. And I have a chapter about this in Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, medication spellbinding. And what happens with any psychoactive agent is that it impairs your ability to know if you're actually benefiting. And we see that extremely in regard to alcohol, regard to cocaine, regard to addiction to the benzos, to addictive drugs. I think you see it to some extent with marijuana. The people think they're really doing better on the drug, and that life is better on the drug. But if you talk to them, the quality of life on a psychiatric drug or any psychoactive drug tends to decline over time. And the person may not even realize this is happening to them. That's one of the reasons why I like to see anybody who's on drugs, to see them with a family member who loves them, because they're likely to say, well, you know, Joe, you used to love to go golfing in the summer, and it's summer again, and you're not golfing, and you're not calling your friends, and you don't really enjoy work that much. And a wife or a husband might say, you know, you really don't show the same interest in me anymore. And the person doesn't know this. The erosion takes place through medication spellbinding. And it can also happen short term, not just long term. You know,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, I like to say that the yardstick by which you measure your own feelings, emotions, function, capacity stretches and shrinks, so you yourself don't see the changes in the same way that people around you, for whom the yardstick is not stretching and shrinking, can measure it. By the way, our phone number, which I forgot to give our listeners, is 310-421-4053. So if you'd like to ask Dr. Breggin a question, it's 310-421-4053. Because back to the conversation that we are having, Dr. Breggin, we in my medical practice, one of the things I use is neurobiofeedback to literally train the brain to function differently, to regulate itself differently through biofeedback involving brain function. And sometimes the very last person to see the changes, which might be obvious to me, to the family, to the workers, to the other people who interact with the patient, the teachers, if it's a child, the very last person to see any change might be the very person who's doing the neurobiofeedback and doing beautifully, but not seeing that difference because that yardstick, the internal yardstick, is stretched or compressed, and they don't notice that.
Well, I think that's really true, and I think it's worsened if the person has an injury to their brain from drugs, or from shock treatment, or from a head injury, because anything that compromises the brain makes it really hard to have self-insight and to know and to understand what your condition actually is. And there are protective mechanisms built into us so that people who are injured don't necessarily grasp how much they are being injured in their brain function.
Exactly. Do you use methods like nutrition, detoxification, neurobiofeedback, and other frequency medicine and so on, and other methods when you're working with people without drugs? Or do you find that the relationship issues and capacities are sufficient?
Well, I don't work with anything basically other than myself and the family, the person in the family. But I start out with a strong recommendation for good nutrition, not for any special nutrition, but for strong nutrition, exercise, and rest. But the human body needs to eat well regularly, the human body needs to exercise, and the human body needs to rest. Many of my patients go to alternatives, and I'm always happy to have people. I'm not a jealous therapist. You can even have another therapist if you want. I mean, I literally see people who expect me to tell them they have to stop seeing the therapist they've seen for 10 years, but they want to see me for a while. That's fine. I want you to get all the help there is. I'm not a great believer in the various alternatives, but I'm not a critic of them either. I want to see the world open for my patients to get chiropractic, to get massage, to get various Chinese approaches, to get whatever they want. The only thing I discourage is anything psychoactive, any herbs that are psychoactive, because they're going to compound the confusion of the withdrawal. But no, I've never gotten into a lot of alternatives, perhaps the way you have and the way so many other people have. But I'm not against them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I have found it very, very helpful, but there are some people for whom having that relationship and working it through without the other methods is what they need. And people are varied. Their needs are varied. Their resources are varied. We have a caller on the line, area code 315. Caller, are you there? Richard, can you open the line for our caller?
Yep, the caller is on air with us.
Okay.
Go ahead, caller. Do you got a question? Apparently not.
Either the caller is shy or we have a technical problem. I'm not sure which. Most likely the second. Richard, I will let you sort that out. I see the caller on our board twice, and I don't know whether that's interfering with things. Anyway, Dr. Breggin, what kind of patients do you find the most difficulty working in your methodology with? Who has the hardest time using what you have to offer?
Same for everybody, probably, Dr. Rima. I think that a person who doesn't want to take responsibility for their lives, who's afraid to take responsibility or resentful about taking responsibility, and who lapses into helplessness, is just doomed unless they can learn to change that. It's like an autonomy button. And the big change comes depending on whether somebody who is in that position sees the light. And it's practically an awakening. It's like almost a religious experience where somebody who has been helpless and blaming other people and not taking charge of their lives suddenly realizes that they have the power to change that. That they can get up in the morning and say, I'm taking on the day. I'm not just going to go to therapy and wait for Peter to say something. I'm going to go there with an agenda of my own. I'm going to tell him what I want to talk about. So I think that the most difficult patient, I believe really ultimately for everybody, is the person who isn't feeling like they're an authority in their own life and is looking for an answer rather than looking for help in taking charge of their life. How does that sound to you? Did I lose Dr. Rima?
I'm not sure, but let me say, Doctor, that to me, you've brought a very important. Sorry.
I'm sorry, Peter. I didn't hear you speaking. Please finish.
Well, I did finish actually. I'm basically saying that a feeling of personal helplessness, maybe a resentment of taking responsibility, a desire to blame others, anything that undermines the person's sovereignty, the person's sense of self and of control and of managing life and wanting to take charge of life is just critical. And people who don't do that end up the victim of drugs. They go to psychiatrists for drugs. Psychiatrists give them shock treatment. It's really dangerous to act helpless in our society, probably in every society.
Do we have a situation, Doctor, where we are in a society that is aimed at making us not self-sovereign and self-reliant, and that we have a social system, a safety net, as it's called, which makes people dependent and instead of independent? Can all that add to the psychological burden, if you will, that people face?
I very much think that's a problem. I often don't talk a lot about it because I really feel the more I get into politics, the more it detracts from the one thing I do that's unique in my world, which is this taking on a psychiatry with a particular basis, the science and the books and the work I do. But I definitely feel that we are developing an entitlement society, and that's not good for people. It may short-term help people. It may seem caring. Sometimes it's absolutely necessary to just reach out and help people. But the more the society moves in the entitlement direction, the more helpless we're going to be, the less able people are going to be to take care of themselves. And I think that unfortunately, we are moving in that direction.
And I'm sorry, is that caller from area code 850?
Yes. May I ask a question? I'd like to ask Dr. Breggin. I'm a registered nurse, and I'm a contractor with two very large healthcare plans in a small state, and we are dealing with a very vulnerable population. And I'm enrolling these patients in an alternative program, and very often these patients are on 9 antidepressants, and when I ask them what their depression level is, they'll tell me a 10. And I'm wondering, for those of us who are not the doctors, but we are bound by our licenses, if you might make some suggestions about how we can deal with these problems that we're observing.
Well, one of the reasons I wrote Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal was to empower you, really quite specifically you. It's called Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, and the subtitle is a guide for prescribers, therapists, patients, and their families. In this case, you would be in that therapist group if you're not a prescribing nurse, as some nurses can prescribe. And I think it's really time for people who aren't prescribers to learn about psychiatric drugs and to start taking the risks, the ethical risks associated with talking honestly with patients and families about their drugs. And I know that's going to be difficult, and I know that's going to be hard, and I know it's going to be risky, and everybody's got to make their own decision in that direction. But I really think that the changes will not come from the prescribers. They get too much power and money from it, and they're too ignorant. People who prescribe all the time are ignorant about human beings. If they weren't ignorant, they wouldn't want to poison them all. So it's the folks like you who are going to have to get organized, maybe meet with other nurses, join our empathic therapy center, empathictherapy.org, meet other people, and learn about the drugs and learn how to talk to people and how to talk to them about what the drugs are doing to them. See if you can get some of these prescribers to talk with you or their patients about reducing the medications.
I'd like to share a story from my own experience that I think is relevant here. I am licensed in New York and Connecticut and Washington State, and there was a hospital in Connecticut with an inpatient psychiatric unit for children from the age of 3 through the age of 16. They had them in 2 separate units, and they had lost their director, so I was asked to pinch hit and become the acting director until they could find somebody to take over, and I said, okay. I had kids on as many as 11 different psychiatric meds, and as you very well know, if you're in the psychiatric med world, once people go on meds, either they're changed out onto other ones or other ones are just piled on top. I had, for instance, a 4-year-old on 11 psychiatric medications, and I said, I can't tell what anybody has. I have no idea what any of these patients, these kids, are suffering from except drug side effects. So I said to the nurses, we will taper every single patient's drug and have a drug holiday for everybody in this hospital unit. And the nurses went insane. They threatened to go to their union. I said, go ahead, do so. I have a union card too. It's called a medical license. And I'm the prescribing physician, and this is what we're going to do. They went insane. They went to their unions, their stewards, their representatives. Ultimately, I had the prescribing power. I took everybody safely and carefully off every drug. And then I found out that I had kids who had been molested. Nobody had asked them. They had just drugged them. I had kids who were simply terrified. I had the child of 2 Muslim professors, American citizens who practiced Muslim religion, and the FBI had broken into their house without a warrant and stolen things, and the the young man who was in his early teenage years simply did not feel safe. Well, why would he? Why would he? And so on. So we had lots and lots of different situations. And we had some people who were, in fact, psychotic, and some people who were reactive to situations. And I was able to sort out and deal with and help the kids and their families. One insurance company administrator called me, an administration nurse, and said, I love what you're doing. If I knew where you were, I would come and kiss you about this particular patient, but you have to put her back on meds. I said, why? She said, because without meds, she has no coverage.
Whoa.
She said, we're going to have to discharge her within the next 12 hours because she's not on medication. I said, she's in treatment. She said, there is no treatment without medication. So sometimes you have to negotiate very weird waters. But the fact is, I agree very, very strongly with Dr. Breggin. Talk to the prescribers, talk to the parents, talk to the patients, and you will find, I believe, methods and means to get people off the toxins and into truth.
Thank you. I do find, and I do find that most of these patients don't, they say they do not want to be on the medications. And I have looked up ethically what by license, what, and it says that in our end, if she has information ethically, that we are responsible to share that with the patient. So I'm feeling more comfortable, and fortunately I work for a company that's very supportive too. So, and all of the nurses feel the same way. So there is a shift. So thank you for helping us get there. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And I think I'm going to get off in a couple of minutes. Let me just finish by saying first that I'm really glad to be on the show. Dr. Rima, that was a wonderful story about what you did on the wards. And I appreciate the nurse's call. And I think there is a shift. We haven't mentioned that. I'm glad she did. There is a huge shift going on out there. When I used to travel around the country talking to mental health providers, with almost any kind of audience, I was often fearful. I often thought, I'm in a certain amount of danger here with the amount of rage that's directed at me. When I travel now, I mean, there's such huge appreciation for what I'm doing on the one hand, and a growing recognition that the drugs are not the right direction. So I think there is a sea change taking place within the country, within the society, but I don't think psychiatry can change. That will have to come from people refusing this kind of flow of treatment. Dr. Rima, thank you for having me on.
Oh, it was a pleasure, Dr. Breggin. Thank you. And as I said at the beginning of the show, you truly have been and continue to be one of my heroes, because you've been telling the truth in spite of the fact that it's been awfully unpopular for a long time.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Breggin. This has been a very powerful learning experience. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all, and goodbye to you and goodbye to your audience for the evening.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Ralph, I wonder as we say goodbye to Dr. Breggin, and thank him so much for being on the show. I wonder if you can talk about how people can protect themselves when the state, the school, the establishment are coming down on them for vaccines, which you and I agree are very, very bad practice. For vaccines, there are medical exemptions and sometimes philosophical and religious exemptions as well. But what about for psychiatric drugs? How does one exempt oneself?
This is a very difficult problem, Dr. Rima, and that's because the law has not really ever been clear. It goes back to that 1905 case, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, and similar cases that dealt with psychiatric drugs later on. A court can declare a person incompetent and turn them over to a psychiatric institution, and they find themselves without redress very often. Although there are people who specialize in litigation involving that sort of situation, and it is a specialty where the hospitals can be challenged in various ways, but it's not an area where the law is well developed. Very often we're dealing with situations where a county court judge is being asked to declare someone incompetent in order to have that person drugged. And the most difficult situations are where it's a minor and the parents are opposed to the drugging. And there are, cases, of course, where the Amish have gone to jail, where parents have run away from the state they were in to another state in order to avoid forced drugging of all sorts, not just psychiatric drugging, but cancer drugging especially. And this is not an area in which people have real control over their own bodies at this point. There are special categories of people who seem to be able to be subject to judicial control and therefore to standard medicine. Because, of course, since it's standard medicine, it is what the judges will enforce.
Let me tell you another story, also from my own life. I met General Byrd in 1991. He was married at the time, and so was I. He was seeking a divorce, and so was I when we met each other. Neither of our spouses was particularly comfortable with the situation, and neither one agreed to a peaceable divorce. Now, General Byrd was asked by his very, very angry wife of the time to go get a psychiatric evaluation because she could not conceive that he could possibly want to leave her unless he were insane. And he said, sure, I'll go get a psychiatric evaluation, no problem. And I said, don't do it. What will happen is that you will be 2PC, that's a two-physician certificate, which will be issued saying that you are not fit to make your own decisions. You will be involuntarily hospitalized. You will be medicated. And of course, saying I don't need medication is an indication in the Kafkaesque world of mental health that you do need medication, because to say that you don't is an indication of your insanity when other people are saying that you do. There's no way out.
This is sort of like like Soviet psychiatry, right?
Exactly. It is absolutely Soviet psychiatry, writ large and practiced in English. So I said, don't do this. And he said, don't be silly. So that night, as fate would have it, we happened to meet a psychiatric social worker for the first time. And I said, his name was Peter. I said, Peter, what do you think of this situation? A person, and I explained the situation, and he said, oh, that person would be 2PC'd, would be involuntarily medicated, and would be remanded to the control of their spouse and psychiatrically hospitalized or jailed anytime they didn't take their medications. It would be a life sentence. And I turned to General Byrd and I said, see? And he said, oh, I guess he believed it more coming from somebody he didn't know. So the next day, he didn't keep his appointment at Northern Virginia Psychiatric Hospital outpatient department. They called and they said, where were you? Actually, his wife at the time called, and she said, why didn't you keep your appointment? Now, that was interesting that they told her that he didn't keep his appointment. And then the hospital called, and they said, why didn't you keep your appointment? We had a bed reserved for you. This is one of the ways in which people lose their liberty and their autonomy and self-sovereignty over their own bodies. They get themselves caught up into the mental health system, and it is so circular and vicious that God help them if that does happen.
Bert would have been.
very
Bert would
dangerous
have
system.
lost 20 years of excitement with the good Dr. Rima, I am sure.
He certainly wouldn't be in Argentina today. That's absolutely true.
Tangling.
He would be dead,
Yeah.
most likely, from
Yep.
the long-term effects of psychiatric medication.
Well, Dr. Rima, I have on the screen for those who are able to see this that wonderful photo of you and General Burt together smiling, and it is good to see you both looking very happy, which is the way we all should be. You know, even
Yes,
we need to be happy warriors. We do need to be happy warriors.
we need to be joyful warriors. And one of the things that I think is very important out of that comment, Ralph, is we're fighting huge forces and enormous battles. And when we know that we're doing it well, doing it right, and doing it together, there's an incredible uplifting joy in that struggle, even though it's difficult.
Indeed. Indeed. Well, there's been a lot going on in the past week, but go ahead.
There's a lot going on. And there's joy. One of the joys that we have is that we have found a way to make it comprehensible to people to end the autism epidemic.
Amen.
Very simple. You can end it personally by ending the vaccinations here now. You can end it socially by making it clear to as many people as possible why the vaccinations have to be ended. And we have a wonderful, wonderful tool to help you do that. Last week, we had a webinar, and the webinar was called Autism and Inside Job, and it was timed to be on the anniversary of the World Trade Center and Pentagon attacks and inside job, if ever there was one. That is September 11th. That webinar was unbelievably badly hacked and attacked, and we couldn't record people. We couldn't get the sound out. We couldn't get the information out. And we said, all righty-o, you don't want this information out? You've confirmed how very, very important this is for us. Thank you so much. And we went ahead and we re-recorded every presenter. So instead of a 2-hour webinar, we have 3.5 hours of powerful video, and an ebook with everybody's slides and everybody's video available. We dropped the price. We said if people will sign up for the Delta Project, that is the project that takes the information and says, don't turn me into one of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World Delta workers, which is what the autistic population is being used for at this point, as workers. Don't Delta me. So we created the Delta Project. If they sign up and they purchase, if they can sign up, and then they have the opportunity to purchase the ebook at a significant discount. Instead of $29.97, they can purchase it for $19.97. 3.5 hours of life-changing videos and a flow of information that will continue to bring them the information that they need to make their own decisions and to help other people make the decisions. Autism does not have to be. Yes, periodically there are autistic people without vaccinations, about 1 in 10,000. At this point, we're moving toward 1 in 50. Genes don't change that fast.
And it's not just autism. And it's not just autism, Dr. Rima. It's not just...
We can stop that.
Right.
So this Autism and Inside Job ebook is an enormously important tool. To get it, you go to www.autisminsidejob. Sign up and become part of the Delta Project. We suggest you also buy the ebook, but even if you don't, We'll send you information. We'll send you gifts. We'll put you on the list of people who receive the newsletter that we send out regularly. This is very, very important. Autism, an inside job.
Yes, Dr.
Autism.
Rima. We're going to have a number of...
Autism needs to stop.
Exactly.
And I just gave the website wrong.
Well, yes, let me give that, Dr. Rima.
I'm so sorry. Tiny. Yes, please.
You are breaking up a little bit, so let me try to do that.
Okay.
It is one of those tiny URLs that we have, tinyurl.com/autism inside job. But we're going to have the link to that page and a lot of other places. So even if you go to the regular website, Dr. Rima, truthreports.com, you'll also be able to get to the ebook. And the ebook is not just about the damages that vaccines cause that we call autism, but about a broader area as well. So, for example, one of the speakers, Dr. Vera Scheibner, reveals during this webinar that when Japan cut back on infant vaccination in the 1970s, it went from being the 17th best country in the world in terms of infant mortality to being the very top, the first best country in the world in terms of low infant mortality. And then another one of our speakers, Clint Richardson, reveals very clearly how core curriculum and workforce education fit into the autism and how it serves the globalist elite. Another one of the speakers, Dr. King, showed us statistically that children were getting twice as much mercury after the so-called 1999 reforms. So when you compare 1999 to 2009, the mercury level that the kids were getting doubled. It's this sort of factual basis that means that this report, this ebook, has actionable information. It has links to important web pages such as our vaccine refuser page that allows you to make a record that you are indeed a vaccine refuser. Dr. Rima.
Now, this is of tremendous importance. It's literally life-changing. tinyurl.com, autism inside job is a good way to get there. Or you can go to our principal website, Dr. Rima, truthreports.com. And that's what it's all about. It's about getting the truth out and being able to make your choices on the basis of what makes sense to you. If you'd like to talk to us in the time that we have remaining, please call 310-421-4053. And you are listening to the Dr. Rima Truth Reports here on Revolution Radio. I'd like to tell you, speaking of revolution, what I saw yesterday. I am staying in a hotel in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, on one of the main streets called Avenida de Mayo, or May, M-A-Y, Avenue. And we were going out to a performance yesterday evening, and suddenly we couldn't go out because there were tens of thousands of people on the street peaceably marching. They had drums, they had loudspeakers, they had people singing what were obviously political songs. They had banners that were 2 stories high and maybe 4 lanes of traffic wide. They were enormous banners. And they seemed to be working class people, as far as I could tell. They had their kids with them. And there were, as I said, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of them. I couldn't tell quite what the issue was because my Spanish wasn't quite good enough, and the slogans didn't tell me the full story. But it was about workers' rights, and it was about unions, and it was about the needs of people. And I thought, how very interesting, how very heartening, because obviously somebody cares a lot about issues. And I was part of U.S. political process again.
Well, Dr.
So
Rima, the answer to that is really interesting because we have a Facebook entry a couple of hours ago. Senator Feinstein, one of the powers in the U.S. Senate, First Amendment is a special privilege, not a right.
whoa!
All right, so, it's naked. It is about as naked as it can be at this point. Will there ever be demonstrations? Yeah, as you know, there were 800,000 bikers riding motorcycles through Washington, D.C. on September 11th. Wasn't much paid attention to by the media of mass deception. 800,000. That's what the figures were that were given out. It was the million biker ride, and they didn't get a million, but they got 800,000 of bikers heading into Washington. They had a way of counting that may have inflated the numbers slightly, but there were lots of bikers driving in and around Washington, D.C. on September 11th.
Wow, was it Patriot bikers?
Yes, it was Patriot
Right.
bikers. Yes, it was.
Patriot bikers.
Yep.
Wow.
So the last defenders of the old republic.
Nowhere in the media.
A little tiny bit, but certainly not played it to any extent. So nor was Feinstein's comment apparently in much of the media, because I came across it only on Facebook. But it's pretty clear from the photos and the rest of it that it's a real thing. There seems to be an attempt by certain senators to define who is a journalist and who is not.
Right.
Because of freedom of the press. But what the senators don't remember, because they're just not smart enough, I guess, or something, is that it's clear constitutional law. The Supreme Court has said over and over again, if a word is such as press is used in the U.S. Constitution, Congress cannot define that word because Congress gets its authority from the Constitution, not vice versa. Only the courts can determine what the word means. Now, that's sort of the courts grabbing power on a certain level, but it is an interesting situation because they're not going to be allowed to define what the word press means.
No, but with the courts being stacked,
well, that too.
Technique. With the courts being stacked, it's going to take a very brave federal judge or a very brave Supreme Court judge to actually render justice and the definitions of justice, but still, it can happen.
And when it involves their own power, they're more likely to act. The members of the court are pretty jealous about maintaining their authority. But we shall see. There are many factors at work in any republic. There are many factors at work. There is no dictatorship here, not overtly anyway. And no one has yet come on the white charger and proclaimed himself to be Caesar. In fact, that will probably happen at some point in the next generation or so, but it hasn't quite happened yet. Instead, the price of gold bounced up $60 yesterday. After Bernanke, because you guys have been down in Argentina, you may not be up on the news here in the U.S., but Bernanke got up. He's in the middle of resigning, and there's a lot of speculation over who's going to be appointed in his place as administrator of the economy or whatever. And he says we're not going to be tapering off the buying. No, we're not going to be tapering it off. And the stock market bounced up, but so did gold. So there are two opinions being expressed. One is that, you have to buy gold in order to protect yourself. And the other is you might as well ride the stock market bubble. Well, the financial institution bubble, the stock market bubble, all those bubbles that have been pumped up by the trillions of dollars in fiat money that's been created since the crisis of 2008 are maybe finally getting to the point where we're heading towards a moment, a crisis moment. I would not be surprised. Congress will, of course, raise the federal debt. That will happen. They will do that in order to fund Obamacare. They have to borrow 40% of whatever the funding is going to be. So they're going to have to raise their debt limit. That will trigger more Treasury note buying by the Fed. It will pump more fiat money into the system to keep the game going a while longer. And at some point, it just busts. But before it busts, it looks like prosperity for a while. That's the lesson from the 1922-23 hyperinflation in Germany. For the first year of that crazy 18 months, it looked like prosperity with zero unemployment in Germany in those days, with an economy that was literally booming. In 1919, at the end of World War I, the Allies stripped Germany of its entire merchant marine, all of the civilian ships, and the entire rolling stock of its railroads. They hauled them off. From 1919 to 1923, the Germans rebuilt the entire rolling stock of the railroad and the entire merchant marine. And they did it initially as a result of the inflation that was building up. And it was only towards the end that economic calculation became so impossible that unemployment over a 90-day period went from the 0% it had been at to 40%. And that was when the whole thing collapsed. But that was because economic calculation was impossible. With modern computers, it may be possible for hyperinflation to run a longer course. We shall see.
That's a new idea. I knew, of course, about the hyperinflation. I knew about the rolling stock
Right.
and the ships and the rebuilding. But
yeah, I've told that story before.
That they did not have the capacity to do the calculations that we do because of computing power. And that was what crashed the system. That's a new idea for me. Could you say a bit more?
Well, it literally became increasingly impossible to figure out what this paper could be traded for. The stories of people taking wheelbarrows and rushing out to buy a few potatoes and all that stuff. That's all true. And especially for businesses, it became impossible to figure out were they making a profit? Were they going bankrupt? What was actually happening? And now with computers, that might be possible, which would be an interesting event. We may find out. But it's got to be getting closer. I can't see how, every fiat currency in human history has eventually blown. This one has lasted a long time compared to the others. But of course, it's backed up by the largest military on the planet, a military which is physically sitting on top of countries with almost all the oil, in the planet. So that may be a factor at work. Yeah.
So what are you doing? You live in the United States.
Right.
What are you doing to prepare, protect, predict? How are you handling this in your family?
We're working towards getting some solar power. We think we need to start getting off the grid, even if we're only doing it a little piece at a time, enough to maintain some communication with the outside world, for example. That I think is going to be very important. We were certainly prepared for short-term crises with generators and that sort of stuff. But short of moving to the deep south, which is always a choice that is available to be made, we really need to prepare to shelter in place if people are going to be allowed to shelter in place. Maybe people up here in the country will get away with that, while people in the city will find themselves in the middle of a Cambodian solution. I don't know.
Yeah.
The situation's increasingly difficult. But on top of all of that, we have the 900-pound gorilla in the room. And here it is, the last 4 minutes of the program. And we should remind people that gorilla is called Fukushima. And Dr. Rima and I have been working with General Burt, with Ambassador Murata, with Arnie Gunderson, and with Professor Busby over the past several weeks and beginning to develop. And there we go. I think we're coming to the end, Dr. Rima.
If you're not on the mailing list at the Natural Solutions Foundation, you need to be there. Go to drrimatruthreports.com and enter your name. I promise you, the information is essential.
That's absolutely true. Well, maybe we're still on. I heard some background sound there. I suppose I should continue and say that what we're doing is we're developing a plan for an NGO approach to dealing with Fukushima. The governments of the world have failed to deal with it. Certainly TEPCO and GE and the others failed to deal with it. It's necessary for people of goodwill around the world to join together and begin to deal with it. Among those people, the four best known individuals on the planet in terms of the number of YouTube video hits and all that stuff are General Burt on the warnings he's given on Fukushima, Ambassador Murata and his warnings, what Professor Busby has warned us about, and what Arnie Gunderson has shown us. Those people together are really the conscience of the planet at this point when it comes to Fukushima, and we are no longer going to sit and wait for TEPCO and wait for Japan, but we're going to be putting together a program. Dr. Rima has been had a very strong hand in drafting the initial proposal to create an international NGO. We recently received some further information from Professor Busby, and this matter will be moving forward, and we'll be reporting it to you in future Dr. Rima Truth reports. Dr. Rima, I have that it's 2 minutes to midnight here on the East Coast, and that means that we are within moments of ending another amazing Dr. Rima Truth reports.
You know, it is so heartening to have your knowledge and to have speakers like Dr. Peter Breggin and to have the caller, the nurse who wants to make it better for her patients. The world is changing. The question is, can we survive the world long enough? Can we survive in the world long enough to see those changes to fruition with things like Fukushima happening? And the answer is yes, if we become and maintain ourselves as active, involved, and problem-solving agents. That's our job. The Dr. Rima Truth Report is a powerful tool for doing just that. As I said before, if you're not signed up, go there, put your name in. Thank you. We'll see you next